Hello. It's hard to control this unruly crowd. I don't get no respect. I don't think it's doing any good. Make sure you cut this part out when you... Last week, we discussed universal moral code and where it might come from. And our choices were, 1, a moral code that came about gradually over a long period of time, beginning with some kind of matter like a rock that, through electricity and chemistry, eventually learned. And it was this inert matter turned highly developed thinking creature that somehow learned to think and feel and gain empathy for other fellow rocks. Or the alternative, we said, was that the moral code we see today has always been there by the very nature of the Creator that put it there, and it was woven into the very fabric of the universe, so that we're supposed to know what right and wrong is before we ever existed. And our conclusion is that second one is the one we're going to follow. And that is the premise with which we will be continuing our study of the Ten Commandments, which this is basically going to be about over the next couple of months or so. Although next week Bill's going to be here, the next 2 weeks Dan's going to teach because I'm going to be gone, and then I will continue that the week after that. So, when we left off our study of Exodus a long time ago, Israel was preparing to meet God on Mount Sinai. Exodus chapter 19, verses 4 through 6 is kind of an initiation of the special call of Israel for covenant holiness with God, with the God of their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God told Moses to say this to the people. I need that turned on, if you will, please. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my commandments, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for my kingdom. You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. Still not on, guys. This is what is known as an if-then statement, or what's known as a conditional statement. So, for instance, it says that if you obey and keep the commandments, then you will be my possession. Which means also that the opposite will be true. That if they do not obey, then God will not keep them as a people. We find the things that Israel must do being spelled out over a long period of the Bible, all right? Basically, starting in the chapter 20, where we're at, and going to be talking about quite a little bit over the next few weeks, through the rest of Exodus, and through all of at least Leviticus. That's a lot of laws, okay? All 27 chapters of Leviticus and another 20 chapters in this book. Ever since the beginning of Genesis, God has always spelled out what he wanted man to do as individuals. Adam was to be fruitful and multiply and have dominion and subdue, and he was told, don't eat of a certain tree. And God told Noah to build an ark. Abraham was told to leave his father's house and go to a land that God was going to choose and show him. But in Exodus, we find God's directive given to the collective, which we haven't seen him do, even though he may have. But we haven't seen that happen yet, I don't think, in the Bible up to this point. Israel as a group is being told to keep the rules and regulations which God will reveal over the next 47 chapters of the Bible. What we are seeing happen throughout the rest of Genesis and Leviticus is the initiation of what most people call the Mosaic dispensation. The Bible is frequently divided into 3 different dispensations or 3 different divisions. And they are the patriarchal, where God spoke to men like Noah and Abraham. The Mosaic, where God spoke through Moses with the law directed by God. And finally, the Christian dispensation, where God spoke through his Son. If we look at this timeline of the story of the history of the world according to the Bible, from God's point of view, so to speak, we can see that the 10 Commandments were given to Moses around 1500 BC, or about 3,500 years ago. Around 2,000 years ago, that's when Jesus lived, died, and the church came into existence. And therefore, in the green oval, we see the time after Jesus died, from Acts to Revelation. In the red oval, we see the time from Exodus to Malachi. And the blue oval is the whole period of time before Moses, which was written about in the book of Genesis. God spoke directly to the men in the blue oval. God spoke to Moses and the prophets during the time designated by the red oval. And he spoke through Jesus, of course, in the green oval at the far right. The question might be asked, where or were the 10 Commandments revealed in all 3 ovals? In other words, the principles of God's moral law, were they revealed in other than just that middle red oval? Before Exodus and after Malachi, did they exist? Before Moses brought the stones of tablet down from the mountains and after Jesus died? In other words, did Adam and Eve know they should not covet the fruit of the forbidden tree? Did Cain know that murdering his brother Abel was wrong? Did Cain's great-great-great-great-grandson Lamech know that polygamy was something God forbid? Were all the people that lived during the time of Genesis intended to keep the same statutes that God wrote on stone from Sinai? And are we expected to keep them today? In other words, we're asking whether or not these are written on the heart, not how they were written how they were written or what they were written on. And I think we're going to see evidences of that being true. Here are some questions I would like to ask, and we're going to kind of talk about a little bit. Oops. You always press the wrong one here. There we go. Questions. I want to read them off here because I changed them slightly. Is Israel being given a brand new moral law never previously heard of by mankind? Were these 10 regulations meant for Israel only? Could or did Egypt, as well as all other civilizations going back to the time of Adam, have known that these 10 rules of living were important? Exodus chapter 19 describes how God descended the mountain in all his power and glory with thunder and lightning, fire and smoke. Israel was forbidden to touch or even come close. They had to go through a purification process before they could even be in the presence of their own God. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, the first words heard from God is one of defense of his own authority. Exodus chapter 20, verse 2, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. This statement becomes the preface or the prologue of the 10 commandments that are going to follow. And then, of course, God continues. I am the one, the only God of the universe. Neither you nor anything else that has been created is a God. Like the old saying goes, there is two things that I am sure of. There is a God, and I am not him. Second, you are not to worship anything except the one and only Creator. God is spirit and does not have a physical form. Assigning anything physical in place or alongside of the one true Creator is not acceptable. I revealed my name to Moses when I spoke to him in the burning bush. My name is to be honored. It is only and always to be used in reverence. Do not misuse my name. I worked for 6 days fashioning a place of rest for mankind, my images, and myself to dwell together. Keep this idea alive and holy by resting every 7 days. This will help you to not forget that dwelling in my rest is one of the perks, one of the things that you need to look forward to when being my people. Always remember that that is the goal, that I wish to dwell with you again. Show respect for the authority by honoring your parents. I created mankind in my image. Murdering one of my image bearers is forbidden. Purity and faithfulness are attributes that I expect you to strive for and to cultivate. Be content with what I give you and do not take what belongs to others. I am truth, and my witness is never false. I expect you to do the same. I will provide you with what you need to survive. Trust in me and do not crave what I have not blessed you with. As we're going to see as we go through this, I mean, this is only one chapter. In fact, it's not even an entire chapter, I don't think, at 20 that it's at. We're going to spend over 2 months on this, on one chapter. There is a whole lot going on in those 10 commandments, and we're going to study them in detail. This is just the overview, so to speak. These 10 rules have been labeled the 10 commandments because they're listed in 10 in both Exodus and in Deuteronomy. Remember that 10 is one of those special numbers that has meanings other than just how many. Here are some examples. The number 10 is the number of completeness of divine order. So anytime you see 10 in the Bible, it is something else besides just how many things. Okay? And like I said, these are but a few examples of how 10 is used in the Bible. God wrote these 10 rules for the same reason. They were to be considered the complete summation of how God wanted man to live. So, is this the first time man had ever heard of these rules for living in any form? Now, I'm not talking about God handing them down as 10 rules. I'm talking about God weaving this into the fabric, and mankind knew that these 10 things that he wrote down for Israel were wrong. Where might we see indications of God's commandments for living being referred to in ancient times that predated Moses? What book in the Bible do we need to look at in order to see if God has always been consistent with respect to his moral expectations? Well, of course, that would be Genesis. That's the only thing that comes before Exodus. As we read the book of Genesis, we see many of its characters violating these same kinds of commands that God gave Moses in Sinai. And many of the times, most often, well, I think every time, in some way or another, they were punished for it. Oops. Not yet. So, for instance, in the beginning, Adam and Eve, remind me later, this is a side note, and I don't know why, Aaron, I want you to work on this. That was supposed to come up with a list that would only come one and then another and then another and then another, and when I translate it from mine to that, it's not doing that, it's just showing up as the list. I got to figure out why. So I'm asking you now during class because I know I forget later. For instance, in the beginning, Adam and Eve lived in God's Sabbath rest. Living in God's rest was supposed to be the norm. It was supposed to last eternally. Of course, Adam and Eve messed it up, and everybody that's been born since did the same thing. We are told that God rested, and what is implied is that if mankind would have lived by God's commands, then he would also have perpetually lived and rested within the boundaries of God's true rest. But of course, we know that didn't happen. We are told that Adam walked with the one true God in the garden. And it wasn't until he and Eve listened to the new lawgiver in the form of a serpent that they determined the Creator was not the only one they would listen to for guidance and moral standards. Therefore, they bowed to another God instead of the one true God. Cain did not give glory to God. He attempted to worship God in a way that he saw fit. And then later, the Tower of Babel did basically the same thing. Man built a monument that was meant to work for the purpose of working their way up to God on their own terms. When Cain became angry with his brother, God told him that he must master his own sin. But instead, he became jealous and he killed Abel. And we read these things escalated until the time of Cain's great-great-great-grandson who murdered for pleasure. Lamech also broke God's marriage laws. Even though God had said that the standard was one man and one woman for life, Lamech didn't do that. He had more than one wife. And later, in Genesis, both Pharaoh of Egypt and King Abimelech tried to take the wife that belonged to Abraham when they already had their own wives and harems, and were both rebuked by God for doing so. Like Eve, we are told that the men of Noah's day saw what they desired as being good in their own eyes, and so they took what they wanted. Things got so bad on earth that by the time we get to Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, it says that every imagination of the thoughts of man's heart were evil continually. So God brought punishment on the whole earth in the form of a flood. Always keep in mind that mankind was punished not for ignorance, but because they knew the rules and they broke them anyway. There are several incidences in Genesis where we see sons and daughters disgracing their fathers. Lot's daughters raped their father, and children and grandchildren were outcast for generations because of it. Noah's son Ham also sinned against his father, and again, the resulting punishment was a curse. And Jacob lied to his father Isaac in order to get what rightfully belonged to his brother. As a result, Jacob struggled with God much of his life. At the time of Abraham, the kings of the east take whatever it is that they want as they rampage through the land of Canaan. And later, we also see that Joseph's brothers lie and cheat for the specific purpose of ridding themselves of the beloved son that their father loved. And we also know that Jacob coveted his dad's blessing. These are but a few ways that the Ten Commandments were broken in the book of Genesis. They were just not called that at that point. This is but a few examples. If we are paying attention when we're reading the book of Genesis, then you should see that all of the sinful events recorded break one or more of the Ten Commandments that God now is giving to Moses. It seems that every act of disobedience committed by the people in Genesis were already known to be wrong before Exodus was ever written, even though the actual tablets of stone did not exist yet. It is not that God's commandments did not exist before Moses. I believe they did. God at Mount Sinai, though, spelled out in a very specific term, in specific ways, and wrote them down in a concise form. But the world already knew that what was right and what was wrong long before Moses ever lived. Once these commands had been written in stone, God had Abraham's offspring, Israel, hold on to them for safekeeping so that they could no longer have excuse. Israel would be reminded. In fact, God's laws were a matter of discussion outside of Jewish circles, even in ancient times. I'm not going to get into this right now, but it's a fascinating study. There's a lot of people, of course, that think that the Bible is a latecomer because it was written after some of these moral codes, that it was copied from the moral codes. That is not true. God wrote them down at a time when he knew it was important, and he wrote it down correctly, and he wrote it down in a way that would correct the record, so to speak. But from our point of view, this is what took place. We have, first of all, a guy named Plato, who lived at the end of the Old Testament times, close to the time of Malachi, about 430 BC. Long before Jesus. Plato was not Jewish, he was Greek. In one of his famous dialogues, Plato posed this question: does God command the law because it is good, or is the law good because God commands it? The answer, of course, to this question is both. And then there is Hammurabi. The Code of Hammurabi was in existence around 1780 BC, which is between Abraham and Moses. This was before Moses. Okay? If God was writing down what Moses was saying and people are already following it, and Hammurabi's code is like 200 and 300 and some years before that, then they had to get it from somewhere. Examples are rule number 8 in Hammurabi's code. If anyone steal another man's livestock, the thief shall pay 30-fold, 10-fold. If the thief has nothing with which to pay, he shall be put to death. Kind of like thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet. Rule number 153. He had a lot more than 10. Okay, there was a lot of these. If the wife of one man on account of another has their mates murdered, both of them shall be impaled. Thou shalt not murder. What is interesting to note is that it was not just God's chosen people that were wrestling with why some things were right and wrong and why God's laws existed in the first place. In fact, we find in Romans chapter 1 that it informs us that the truth about God, his nature, and his laws were made known to mankind in a way that they should have known him and worshiped him from the very beginning. But mankind did not listen to God. They know God's decrees, and those who practice such things deserve to die. Okay? This is a passage that we've repeated here at the congregation many, many times before. The laws of God, however they were originally stated, and we're not told exactly how that was, were known to mankind from the very beginning. Even Adam and Eve managed to violate nearly all 10 of these rules. Taking the forbidden fruit was theft, stimulated by a desire of and wanting to covet, based on a lie about God's very character. And listening to the serpent and eating the fruit was a way of looking to another god. And what they did in the end was tantamount to murder, because it led to the death of the entire human race. From the very beginning, our first parents were bound by the same basic principles that the 10 Commandments that are found in Exodus and Deuteronomy convey. I believe that a moral code was present long before Israel ever reached Mount Sinai. So why did God write them on stone for Israel to carry around in the wilderness? We could think of them, I think, as a fresh copy, a republication in the form of a summary. This was not the first time mankind have heard of each of these kinds of laws, but it was a codification and declaration of these laws given by God to his newly formed nation. And that part, I think, is important. But some may ask, and I've heard it asked in Bible classes my whole life, what about the Old Testament laws of sacrificing animals and eating certain meats and the hundreds of other things that were commanded that Israel was supposed to do or not do? And that, I think, is a good question. But let's not get mixed up. There's more than one kind of law going on here. What some often fail to realize is that the Old Testament law, like any other set of rules, contains more than one type of regulation. Okay? So, we have civil law, ceremonial law, and moral law all going on at the same time. All of these types of rules were important to God's plan of redemption, as well as Israel's well-being as a nation, but each was essential for a different reason. We are going to spend just a little bit of time with these three categories, but before I do, I want to just briefly talk about a place called Judaism 101. Found this by accident here a few weeks ago. It lists 613 commandments found in the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They are broken into categories on this website here, such as God, Torah, love, illness, prayer, family, diet, business, justice, temple, sacrifice, war. There's like 35 different headings that they're placed under, and some of these are put under more than one heading. And they're all categorized, and you can click on any one of them that's on that site, and they'll take you directly to an interpretation and to the scripture in the Pentateuch where they come from. But for our purposes, we're only going to look at the civil, ceremonial, and moral laws. First of all, and you're supposed to only see civil law up there, number one, all right, so don't read the other ones yet. Civil law under Moses, of course, consisted of the laws that governed Israel as a nation. These included such things as guidelines for wages, restrictions of land use, regulations for debt, and penalties for violation of Israel's legal code. Think about it this way. It's like the speed limit or other things like that. It has to do with the well-being of the society as a whole in whatever area you live in. We have, for instance, and I'm going to use rule numbers from this Judaism 101 website. Rule number 275 is found in Leviticus chapter 5, verse 23, where it says that a person must restore that which he took by robbery. Or rule number 182 in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 36, that will ensure that scales and weights are correct when doing business. Civil laws were meant to keep the peace and to make sure Israel's system of judgment could deal with lawbreakers. Okay, now you can look at the ceremonial law, number 2. Ceremonial law involved regulations for celebrating various religious festivals like the Passover and the Pentecost, and they defined how God would be worshipped in the temple. Ceremonial law included such rules as clean and unclean foods, purity, the conduct of Israel's priests, and offerings and sacrifices. They specified which animals got sacrificed for what reasons and how many days for what reasons people were considered to be unclean, and which animals could be eaten and which could not. Much of what we designate as the law of Moses was comprised of these ceremonial laws, like rule number 112. That's found in Exodus chapter 23:14, that tells how and when to celebrate the Passover. Or rule number 14, which states that a person was not to eat flesh of unclean animals. There are many ceremonial laws given in the Pentateuch. Much of this part of the law was to be seen as highly symbolic in the end. We'll talk about that in a second a little bit. For these laws were types that pointed to the coming promised seed. So, moral. The Jewish civil law, the moral code of God that is summarized in the Ten Commandments. These laws should be considered the righteous and eternal standards for our relationship with God and with our fellow man. It is this moral code that has been in existence since the beginning, when God first placed his newly created images in the garden. And it are these laws that have never changed. It's these laws, the moral code part, that we're going to be talking about in the Ten Commandments. The Jewish civil law has expired. Although the civil law that was given to Israel in the Old Testament contains principles that are useful for governing in any nation, we should not think of these laws from the time of Moses as being enforced today. We have different rules for weights and measures and various things like that. Israel didn't have a 75-mile-an-hour speed limit. Okay, those kinds of things change over time. God gave those to Israel for a reason. Jesus even said, render to Caesar's what is Caesar's. And Paul said, every man is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. We're not governed by Rome. We're not governed by the laws of Moses. We're governed by the laws in the United States of America. The Old Testament ceremonial laws are also no longer in effect. They have been rescinded. For instance, when Peter in his vision, according to Acts chapter 10, recorded in Acts chapter 10, was shown a sheet filled with ceremonially unclean animals, which he knew he wasn't supposed to eat, it was God that told him to kill and eat whatever animal he wanted. Then later, Peter was, when he saw Cornelius and his household received God's Holy Spirit, he realized that the whole idea of clean and unclean animals in the Old Testament had been used for all these hundreds of years as a type of what was going to happen to both Jew and Gentile when they would both come together in the church. They were highly symbolic. Corinthians chapter 2 puts it this way: these are a shadow of things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. The whole Jewish system of ceremonial laws were for that purpose, to foreshadow the coming seed and to reveal a higher truth when the promised seed in the form of the Messiah did finally come. Much of the Jewish ceremonial law was created to be types and foreshadows that pointed forward to the cross and to the kingdom. It is these kinds of laws that Paul says we are no longer under. And even though they were impossible to keep, we know there is one that fulfilled them all. His name was Jesus of Nazareth, the Messiah, the Son of God, the seed that was promised to Abraham, the true seed. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, do not think that I come to abolish the law and the prophets. I do not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Yes, Jesus kept God's moral laws and God's Israel's civil laws, but more importantly, he became the fulfillment of all the ceremonial laws. This Jesus, the predicted Son, became the one and only sacrifice for sin. And it was through him that the unclean would again be allowed to enter God's presence, so that the holy and righteous God that we read about in the Bible could once again dwell with an unholy people. All of the types and shadows and the predictions contained in the ceremonial law and found in the Old Testament were fulfilled in Jesus. And therefore, after he died and rose from the dead, they were no longer of any use. It wasn't that they were just done away with. He did them all. No need for any more because he came. And that brings us to the moral law again. And this one is the one I believe that transcends time. What about this third law given to Israel, the moral law, the moral code that is etched in stone? The moral code that goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 2 and continues throughout the rest of the Old Testament. Are these moral laws still in effect today? And some people will say, well, he did away with the Ten Commandments, but Jesus restated them in a different way. And I don't think that's always the best way to look at it. We're going to talk about that in detail as we go through this in the next several weeks. All right? All right, now I lost myself. Oh yeah, I'm right here. Are these moral laws still in effect today? I think we can safely say that God's moral laws are universal, and as we have seen in what we talked about already, were laid down by God in some form or another from the very beginning of time. Therefore, it would seem to me like these laws transcend time and that they are also present and alive in the teachings of Jesus and found in the writings of the New Testament. We're going to look at some examples of that also. First, we know that in John chapter 1 and other places in the New Testament that Jesus was God. And in John 14:6, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And in John chapter 10, Jesus states, I and the Father are one. In other words, there is only one God, and Christians are still supposed to honor and worship the same God as anyone else through all of history did, even though the method of worship has changed. In 1 John chapter 5, we read, Dear children, keep yourselves from idols. Using an image to worship God was wrong throughout the Old Testament and is still wrong today. You see, God is invisible for a reason. Part of the genius of invisibility is that it does not place limits on God's greatness. The limitations of idolatry are evident in the fact that as soon as the worshiper reduces God to any association with some manufactured object, God's greatness also becomes limited, which I believe is one of the reasons why mankind had to have a lot of different gods, as we saw when we studied what the gods were in Egypt. But God has no limits. He is omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient. Jesus in Matthew chapter 6 says, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Honoring God's name is part of the fabric of the universe. Jesus honored God's name himself, and he also prayed that we do the same thing. We know that from reading Genesis chapter 2 that God's plan for marriage was that we should, not marriage, we're not there yet. God's plan for mankind was that we should perpetually live in his Sabbath rest. Israel was to mimic this idea for over 1,400 years, and they tried to do so. But as Jesus said, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened. I am the one that is going to give you the rest that you're looking for. God's true rest has never been about any specific single day of the week. We're going to discuss that Sabbath idea when we get to that command quite extensively. It is at the end of Revelation that we see God's victory over Satan resolved in the same kind of garden setting in which he had placed man at the very beginning. And as Christians, part of the promise is that we will finally be able to once again dwell in this rest of God's. Ephesians, Paul says, chapter 6, Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for it is right. Honor your father and mother. Even the wording here is almost identical. Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, You have heard it said that you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to the judgment. You might remember that God first called out Cain for being angry with his brother. Jesus is saying the exact same thing to us in this passage. Matthew chapter 5, verse 28. You have heard it said that it was that you shall not commit adultery, but I say unto you that anyone that looks lustfully at a woman has already committed adultery in his heart. Paul says in Ephesians chapter 4, he who has been stealing must stop, must steal no longer, and must work instead. Colossians chapter 3, Paul says, do not lie to one another. And finally, James in chapter 4, he says, when you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. Basically the same thing as do not covet. So, in the moral law of Moses, is the moral law of Moses still with us today? I believe the answer is yes. God's moral law has been present and consistent ever since the very beginning of time, and it can be seen in some form or another in every dispensation of the Bible history. And we are going to, after a few weeks that I'm going to be gone, delve into commandment by commandment. Any questions today, though? Thank you.